Thank you for being here. It's a beautiful day, and it's nice to have you on our campus where we're starting to get things cleaned up after a lot of construction projects. I teach, actually I'm a historian, but I'm teaching a couple of courses in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies this semester, and one of them, which I've taught for a long time, is called Prophecy and Order. And it started out many years ago as essentially a survey of the history of religious orders, from the origins of Christianity up to mostly up to about the 19th century. But over time, the course has evolved to include not only religious orders, but any way in which people have taken the gospel so seriously that they actually kind of embrace a radical form of Christianity, a radical commitment to the gospel. And so it now includes even Dorothy Day and Oscar Romero, seeing these as contemporary examples of how somebody might follow Christ. So one of the things is I'm not an antiquarian, and I'm not talking about the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers, because I think our problems will be solved if we go back and imitate people who lived while the Roman Empire was still flourishing in some ways, but rather because we could see them as analogies for the kind of choices we have to make, and maybe our students have to make as well, because they're all going to be asking themselves, how are they going to be following Christ? This was, one of the things I also want to point out is that this course on prophecy and order is really not just about how ascetic the individual figures were. That is to say, how much could they burden themselves with in terms of stones in their shoes, or not eating for 3 weeks, or whatever. But rather, how did the development, or how do these turns in how people choose to follow the gospel relate to or are impacted by the world that they live in? So I'm really looking, when I teach my students, I'm looking at turning points rather than ideal models, okay? And one thing to keep in mind is, of course, is that the asceticism that we're talking about of the fathers and the mothers doesn't really even exist historically until after the legalization of Christianity. Because before the legalization of Christianity, you didn't have to try very hard to suffer as a Christian, did you? Right? I mean, that's the whole point. Then once Christianity is legalized, suddenly the bishops are effectively ministers of religion for the Roman state. And they're all of a sudden, they have their, fairly, I wouldn't say a soft job, but it's certainly a different one than it was when Ignatius of Antioch was around, right? And the other issue is that in the early period, the earliest generation or two of Christianity, the Roman Empire is at its height, right? It's not in decline, it's not falling apart. But my topic tonight is about this afternoon is Desert Fathers and Mothers in the Twilight of Empire. Because essentially, by about the 3rd century, the Roman experiment really starts to crack. The Roman Empire is starting to come apart. And so if you, in fact, choose to leave the city to follow Christ fully, you're also making a comment about the hollowness, you might say, of the world around you. All right. So what I want to do is I'm not here to sort of give lessons for you to teach children about how to put a stone in their shoe or anything like that. That's not what this is about. But how we might think about how we choose to commit ourselves fully to the gospel, which is a pretty scary thing to do, actually. So in other words, one of the things I want to ask is, to what extent is following the gospel an act of conformity to religious and social norms, which very often we end up as Catholics teaching ourselves that we're doing? How do I be a good Catholic? How do I be a good Christian, right? How do I follow the rules and get along? And to what extent is it in fact an act of radical countercultural rejection of the status quo, whether that status quo is political and social on the one hand, or religious and ecclesiastical on the other? How do changing social and political conditions influence those who are trying to pursue the evangelical counsels, right? In other words, doing it today is going to be different than it was 300 years ago. And so really, in terms of today, to what extent were the ancient ascetics already recognizing the decline and bankruptcy of the Roman world. In other words, they weren't really, in many cases, what we're going to see is they're not leaving a world that is in fact vibrant and strong and growing. They're actually, in a sense, calling time on something that no longer is of much significance to them. Keep in mind as well that the Greco-Roman world was an urban civilization. Aristotle described the human person as a zoon politikon, the political animal. In other words, his understanding was that in order to be fully human, in order to flourish, you needed to do that in a city, in a city-state. And yet, when we look at this, this attainment of full humanity is no longer really accomplished the way it was at the time of Aristotle, because so many people would have been alienated from the imperial scale structures of the Roman Empire. So to leave the world, in the case of people like Antony of the Desert or Macrina or others, was to practice an asceticism that was really countercultural. They're leaving the world, they're leaving the cities. The desert was the opposite of the Greek city-state or polis, a place of isolation, a place of demons, a place of wild animals. What could be accomplished there? And it must have looked like insanity to some people living in the cities that these individuals were going to choose to go off and live and claim to flourish in a place that they thought was the world of death and demons. And by the way, I have to tell you, while I was putting this together, I noticed there was an article in America Magazine yesterday about a recent Netflix hit that I haven't seen yet called K-Pop Demon Hunters. People heard of this already? You know, I got to watch it now because in a certain respect, I think there's a direct line from Antony of the Desert to Netflix now. What could be accomplished in the desert, right? Well, obviously, there are gospel sources of asceticism, John the Baptist, Christ in the desert, and of course, most fundamentally, the evangelical counsels, right? When the rich young man asked Christ, "What must I do to enter the kingdom of God?" he says, "Go, sell all that you have, give it to the poor, then come follow me," right? That is a very strong statement. And it's one for hard. It's hard for any of us. I find it interesting, teaching students, most of whom have never read an entire gospel before, and the bits and pieces they get on social media are kind of, the kinder, gentler version of Jesus, and you all of a sudden have them read that, and their eyes kind of open up a little bit. It's just not a bad thing, I think, just to have people to read that. Okay. In other words, the evangelical counsels are this call to radical commitment to the gospel, right? I also want to point out something else that changes in this era of Antony of the Desert and of Macrina and of others is what the historian Peter Brown would call the location of the holy, all right? It's no longer, as it had been earlier in the Greco-Roman world, in places. In other words, it's not in places like at Delphi, where you'd go to the Oracle of Delphi to try and find it there, or an invisible god such as Asclepius. It's rather, it comes to be the belief in the Christianity of late antiquity that the holy comes to reside within the hearts and souls of the friends of God. So if you want to encounter holiness, you encounter it in the person who is a friend of God, all right? In these persons, human beings to whom God has transferred power. And so there's great emphasis at this time on actually looking at the holy person. You don't sit down and read a theological textbook. You sit down and you actually watch one of these ascetics in the desert. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the cult of the saints and the veneration of saints' tombs becomes so important, is because those who are considered the friends of God remain the friends of God even in death, and the place of their burial is a place that might emanate this holiness even after their death. So it kind of explains the rise of this cult of the saints. So holy persons, in the view again of Peter Brown, are for him ones that you observe for holiness, and you see in them people who are not so much otherworldly, which I think is an important thing to think about, because often we think of holy people or monks or those who were hermits in the desert as being otherworldly. Peter Brown, the greatest historian of late antiquity, would say we're really talking about people who are what he would call upper worldly. And that is to say, they don't lack a concern for the world or things going on around them, but they maintain a strong connection between this world and the kingdom of heaven, this world and the next one. In fact, Brown describes the holy person of that era as one whose heart was on high, one whose heart was on high, which is kind of an interesting idea. It's sort of like you're not really separating yourself from the cares of the world, but you're doing it from a perspective where you hold your heart up at a higher place. One of the reasons why we get to hear so much about the ascetics in the desert is because people are fascinated with them. In other words, they're going out to look at them, to watch them. If the holy is to be found in a person, if that person's out in the desert, I'm going to go out and watch them. Antony isn't so much writing a rule as Athanasius, we're going to find, writes a biography of him, which is the next best thing to actually observing him. And we'll come to that. But you really, what you find is that the irony of these people is they want to be hermits. They want to go out into the desert. They want to get away. You know, they might be wanting to quote Marlene Dietrich, I want to be alone. But nobody will leave them alone, all right, because they keep going out to see them, all right? And so very often in the early period, we call these people the athletes of God or God's athletes. In fact, the Greek term that's used to describe them is anakoresis, a displaced person. In other words, the original word is they're a displaced person, right? Can anybody say that out loud today and not find themselves in a debate about something, right? This is, of course, referring to a Christian ascetic movement of displaced persons who started a new life. They displaced themselves from the cities in which they had been living to start anew and to do something radically different with their life. And hence, we get this word that's much more common among religious orders, anchorites, who are hermits, or in Greek, monos, those who are alone, hence monk. But basically, anchorites are these hermits in the desert or anywhere else. The Syrian tradition excelled at this. If there was an extreme games of asceticism in the 4th century, the Syrians would win the gold medal every time, all right? They are the heroes of the tradition, and the best example is a guy named Simeon Stylites, who's shown there in the image on the right. That's an 8th century bronze image from modern-day Iraq showing Simeon, a monk, a hermit, who's gone out into the desert, but who's so put upon by all the people who want to see him that he's got to separate himself, and he does so by putting up a pillar and climbing up and sitting on top of the pillar, right? And so you see him up there reading, sitting in a basket. There's a stairway going up on the side, a ladder, I suppose, and winding around it is a serpent, who is a symbol of the demons that are still besetting him at this time. And people would come to him for advice. He would give it, but he's basically trying very hard. And of course, he would go for days without eating anything more than bread and water. He sometimes decided, at one point he claims to have stood, I think, for about 3 months on one leg. I don't know how you do that, but in other words, there's a great emphasis on, sort of these mortifications to sort of establish a kind of control over the body. In this respect, there's actually something still, I think he's still rooted a little bit in the Greco-Roman tradition of saying that you want to control the passions, to let the mind direct you, and he's kind of doing that at that time. I mentioned the snake going up there, and it's October, and I couldn't talk about demons without putting up an image from The Exorcist, but that's really neither here nor there, but I like the picture. Keep in mind that one of the things that's going on at this time is that once Christianity sort of establishes a kind of monotheistic way of understanding the universe, This creates a need to deal with, in a new way, all of the different powers that people believed were out there in the universe. In other words, when you're a polytheist, you can say, apart from, let's say, whoever is the God that favors you, there are all kinds of gods out there that could be trouble to you. Christians didn't stop believing in all of these supernatural powers. They just suddenly started to call them demons rather than gods, right? They all get a demotion, right? And this wasn't just the sort of the ordinary person. St. Augustine was completely convinced of the reality of demons, okay? So what you've got is a world where you have widespread belief in demons, and ordinary people feel the need to recognize who was holy and who was, in fact, in some way a sorcerer or a servant of the evil ones or of evil powers. So that's why if you actually sit down and read the life of St. Anthony of the Desert, large parts of it are about the devils and the demons that beset him and how he deals with that. And nothing, I mean, there are very few things that I've ever given to a student that look more foreign on one level to them than this. But if you ask them about their fears, they have very real fears about the world around them. And by analogy, we can perhaps get them to think imaginatively through texts like that about what's going on in their world, because they want to be protected from those things that are evil in the world. And so just as there was a changing perception of the location of the holy, there was a changing perception of evil and the location of evil. And so these people don't escape evil by going out into the desert. A lot of people say, I want to get away from this, all of the sinfulness of the world. I'm going to go build myself a farmhouse on the top of a lovely, mountaintop someplace. They knew that you never get away from it because it's always going to be there. The demons, therefore, came to be seen by Christians as an explanation for evils of all kinds. And the monks are the prize fighters against evil. That's what's going on there. They're the prize fighters against evil or the evil one. And one of the best examples is St. Anthony of the Desert. Lives from 251 to 356. I want to know what he ate. Lived for 105 years, according to, this. And that's not necessarily legendary. He may have actually lived that long, but he's Egyptian. He grows up in a city as any sort of citizen of the Greco-Roman world would. But what happens in his life is he literally hears the gospel text. Go sell all that you have, give it to the poor, then come and follow me. And you know what? He took the scriptures, he took God at God's word. And what happens to your life when you take God at God's word? He abandons all. He abandons the city he lives in, all right? And he becomes so renowned for his holiness that even a bishop and a saint as renowned as St. Athanasius takes the time to write his biography. And of course, St. Athanasius is one of the most important bishops and theologians of the 4th century. And so, of course, this gets us to be one of the historiographical problems of reading about these people. How much of what we read is actually Antony? And how much of it is Athanasius, right? In other words, how much of Antony is getting packaged in a way that's amenable to Athanasius? Athanasius is very wary of anti-establishment ascetics, because you can imagine there are a lot of people, as we're going to see, who are so grumpy about the church having become worldly that one of the reasons for going out into the desert is to get away from people like Athanasius, right? So in a certain respect, Antony is making sure that you're presenting somebody who's ecclesiastically acceptable as well, okay? So Antony is a model for Athanasius in this regard. He leaves the city, he goes out into the desert among the tombs, all right? This image on the right, which I think you'll all have access to this later if you want it, but it's a wonderful image of Antony lying there on the ground with a white beard, beset by demons in the shape of all kinds of wild animals. Before he even gets to the desert, he goes to the tombs. And the tombs are the very place that most people at that time would have said that the tombs were infested with demons. To walk into the tombs was to walk into the place that they all thought was literally the most dangerous place they could possibly go. I remember in the 80s, yes, I'm that old, in the 80s, and I was studying early medieval history in graduate school, a professor was trying to find an analogy to try and get across to people in the 1980s about how scary and dangerous that would have appeared to people in our generation. And she said, imagine somebody who decided that they were going to walk right into a nuclear power plant that was melting down. Right? In other words, what was, especially in the 80s, one of the most scary things that we could imagine, because it was kind of starting to happen in a few places, right? Was that he goes out into the most, in other words, he's overcoming everything that can cause fear for the people who are there in these tombs, right? It's an uninhabitable place, which he makes habitable, all right? In fact, among the many things he drives out snakes. And the first time I read this story as an Irish kid, having grown up on stories of St. Patrick, to find that Antony in the desert had driven out the snakes first, made me realize that, in fact, the Irish, sort of people writing Irish history of St. Patrick were probably borrowing liberally from the life of St. Anthony of the desert. Yeah, can you imagine them making something up? Can you imagine, So, in other words, the point of all of this isn't just about the demons. It's about saying, can we create spaces where human beings can live in peace? That's a part of really what's going on there. He's confronting the demons, he works healings, but as St. Athanasius will tell us, he respects the church and he respects the clergy. He's not an Arian, in other words, he's not a heretic. He's not somebody who's ignoring the priests. And he does have a skeptical attitude towards the learned and towards learning. But it may be that he's skeptical actually towards traditional Greco-Roman learning rather than the Bible, because certainly when you read these texts, the Bible is very much, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is very much a part of the culture of these new ascetics, right? And as I say, there's emphasis on the imitation of the holy person. There's the rudiments of a rule in the biography of Antony, but really, if you want to know what holiness is, it's not about following the rule, as you might later with St. Benedict, let's say, or St. Augustine, or St. Ignatius, for goodness sakes, but, where the rule is about 800 pages long, like that. But with him, you just look at the holy person. If you want to know what's holy, go and watch the person who's holy, right? Maybe that's something we can do all like this, and ask our students to, identify the person that you trust the most, you admire the most, and just follow them around for the day, right? And then write that up a little bit, okay? So there are problems for the church, which, what responsibility did these monks have to the larger church? I mean, if they go off into the desert, they're not in the city where most of the churches are operating. Some saw urban Christians, in fact, as lax, both monks and lay people. In other words, once Christianity became legalized, it could relax a little bit. And once that happens, one of the reasons they go into the desert is to live a life that's of greater seriousness. And so the problem is the monks are becoming moral authorities, and the bishops and the clergy are worried that, in fact, the lay people are actually giving them more authority than the clergy in the cities at times. And in fact, we find, at this time when clergy were not required to be celibate, that the movement towards celibacy is in some ways initiated by lay people who want their urban secular clergy to be as holy as the monks in the desert. And one way of doing that, at least to start, is to be celibate. So you start seeing lay people actually avoiding masses said by priests who were married. And there are examples of early church councils where the bishops actually say to the lay people, do not avoid masses said by married clergy. Okay? So there is this tension about what do we mean by holiness? And where is holiness in a situation like that? As I say, sometimes these ascetics could demonstrate a strong sense of individualism and separatism. Some chose not to attend public church services. This is why Athanasius is writing about Antony, because he's an acceptable form in a certain respect. The problem was, does this weaken local Christian community by removing the most zealous? In other words, what would Alexandria have been like if these thousands of monks who'd gone to the desert had remained in Alexandria? I suppose it's a question we could still ask ourselves today. I'm not claiming to have an answer on that one, but were they praying only for their own salvation, or are they praying for the larger church? And it seems to me that that's a kind of, eternal question within Christianity about how we live our lives, any one of us, whether we're monks or not, what is the connection between our worship and our living, right? I also want to move into the issue of women and asceticism, which is really fascinating in a way. And we have to ask ourselves, how and to what extent could women participate in this movement? The social position of women in the ancient world complicated their role at that time, just as it does today. Jewish traditions limited participation of women, at least in formal worship in some ways, as active as their role would have been in the home. And Greek attitudes to women, coming from philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, also, of course, complicated the issue as well. The sort of Greek philosophical view of women as having a tendency to suffer from what Greek doctors called hysteria as a medical diagnosis, and hysteria being literally, if you can believe it, the belief that somehow or the other the uterus gets out of place and starts floating around in the wrong place in the body. And the medical treatment is to return the uterus to its proper location, okay? And these were the smart guys who came up with this, right? Okay, I mean, this is Plato and Aristotle, right? So the issue, and I'm not blaming them. I mean, this is the 4th century BC when they're writing this stuff down, right? But the point is that this builds a world in which male writers tend to see women as less rational than men, and that therefore they are not capable of exercising public authority in any aspect of society, right? So keep in mind that that's the background. And so once Christianity adopts, in fact, Greco-Roman philosophy, you start to see that the sort of same understanding of women is expressed in writers like Jerome or Augustine. What did women have to do, and how did they have to do it? How did they negotiate social limitations in order to participate in this ascetic movement, right? And then there, of course, I'm a historian, so I have to add in the historiographical problem. That is the problem of the sources. How do we know of them? How do we know of any of the women who participate in this movement? What are the sources? And part of the issue is virtually all of the sources come from men that knew them, not from themselves, right? So you always have to understand that there's a certain set of lenses that are already on the document for you when you start looking at it. I realized I went too long this morning, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there are really a couple of points I want to make about the Desert Mothers first. And what we find is that this is the earliest example in Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries of women choosing to participate in this culture of asceticism as well. The one woman I want to talk about briefly, just for a moment, is Melania the Elder. And she's characteristic of a lot of these women. She's rich, she is from the highest ranks of society, and she has the freedom to go and explore these options in life. This is not something that was readily available, therefore, to the poor or the working class. She was born of a highborn woman of a family of consular rank in Spain, who travels through Rome before she goes on to Egypt and then ends up in Bethlehem, actually using her own wealth to pay for the protection of ascetics there. Okay, that's not it's not insignificant that she was rich. Okay, because that was a part of it. But she's making a choice about this. She was a widow. That's one of the reasons she was free to do this, and I'll come back to this. Another example is Saint Macrina, or Macrina if you're Irish. Um, Lives from 330 to 379. Okay, so in the generations after the legalization of Christianity, she was the sister of Saint Basil the Great, and Saint Gregory of Nyssa. In fact, she came from a large family. There were about 7 kids in the family, and I always find interesting, 5 of them, I think, are saints. I would have liked to have met the other 2. Like, what happened to those 2, right? Not to mention her grandmother, who was his name, right? So she is a person whose family has great wealth and power in Asia Minor. That is to say, modern-day Turkey, all right? She was widowed at 12. Now, I put that into quotation marks because I think she was betrothed, but according to Roman legal custom at that time, of course, most young women would not have made their own choice from that social, from the wealthy and, sort of politically significant classes. They wouldn't have chosen their own husband. That would have been chosen for them by their fathers or their brothers or whatever. But once they were widowed, they had much more freedom to choose whether and to whom they would marry. And she chose not to marry. So she used, in a sense, a mechanism of Roman sort of marriage practices to choose to not remarry, even though she was only 12 at the time that her betrothed passed away. And what happens is, instead of going out to the desert, she turns her household into a monastery. The whole household becomes much more ascetic, and she's effectively the leader of a monastic community in her own home. In fact, St. Basil the Great is very well known, of course, for the rule of monks that he wrote that is still the predominant rule for monks in the Eastern churches. And some people argue that after he traveled around watching others, he came back and he saw what his sister was doing, and his sister's household was influential on him in the formation of his own rule. While there, she, you might say, therefore, brings the desert to her home, which is kind of a notion that is very appealing to me, because I suppose we could ask that question of ourselves. How do we bring the desert to our homes, especially at times like Lent, for example? One of the things is she freed the household servants, the slaves of her family, who remained within the household, and she waited on them. So one of the things I'm trying to point out is she's somebody who comes from the upper echelons of Roman society. She's presented as a silver platter with all of the privileges of the elite of the Roman world, and she, without leaving her house, turns that society's values upside down. In other words, this is a radically countercultural way of operating without even leaving her own home. All right? And by waiting on slaves at that time, that's a pretty radical statement at that moment. So she's a significant person, right? Nevertheless, her biography is written by her brother, Gregory of Nyssa, who always describes her virtues in quite masculine terms. And that's why we have to watch out the text. I mean, they get, like her manly courage, things like that, or, her virile courage, that kind of thing. You hear that. So when you read the text, you have to kind of keep an eye on who's doing what, where. So again, this is an example. The historiographical problem is, how do we know about the woman ascetic? We know about her because her brother wrote about her, okay? We don't have her autobiography, okay? And I want to kind of sort of bring this to a close by going to some place that in a certain respect is the exact opposite of the desert. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of empire. And yet, asceticism puts down roots there eventually as well. And one of the things I want to point out, because I love Rome, I used to teach a course here on the history of the city of Rome, where I took students during spring break to Rome and walked them 8 or 10 or 12 miles a day and saw all kinds of things. And then, of course, we could eat all the ice cream we wanted to after we'd walked 8 or 10 miles, right? So I love maps of Rome, and you may not be able to see this now, but when you look at it individually, you'll be able to later. all of the column on the left-hand side of items that are numbered point out places on the map that were from classical antiquity and therefore from pagan society. And you find that they're all at the heart of that space that is the city of Rome. This is about 330 AD, so less than about 20 years after the legalization of Christianity. The column on the right-hand side of items that are lettered, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all of those are items of already existing Christian sites around the year 330. And they are either outside the walls or just inside. In other words, the map itself is an illustration of how marginalized Christianity was even in Rome after the legalization of Christianity in the first generation or two after the legalization. In fact, one of the reasons why Constantine moved and established a new capital at Constantinople was that he wanted his capital to be a Christian city. And there was so much fidelity to the pagan tradition in Rome that he could never get the pagan elites in Rome to do that at first. Okay? Christianity initially is rather marginal. But increasingly, there is growth in the Christian community and conversion among that Roman elite. These people who are the Romans of the Romans, people descended from the consular families, families of Roman senators for centuries, and patrician women among them begin to convert, become Christians, and they, in doing so, start to engage in this countercultural Christianity where they are rejecting their social status and they're living lives of greater simplicity. In other words, what we're starting to see is that you don't have to go off to the desert to reject the values of ancient Rome, because ancient Rome itself is already losing its hold on the hearts and minds, even of those who were, you might say, the Mayflower descendants of their own society, okay? And so we see this kind of mix going on between Christianity and Roman culture. The image on the right is the mausoleum and church of Santa Costanza in the 4th century. That was actually built, it's believed, as the mausoleum for Constantine's daughter, Constantia, who, of course, if you're the daughter of the emperor, then you easily get to be a saint. And so she becomes Santa Costanza. But this mausoleum then becomes a church, but then you can see what's happening is that Christian worship spaces are taking on the aspects of Roman culture. There's a kind of inculturation going on at that time. And that brings me to the last person that I want to talk about, who I find just incredibly fascinating. Saint Marcella, 325 to 410. She is one of these people, a Roman of the Romans, of a patrician Roman family. She is very wealthy, and like many of these other women, she is required to marry, still as a young girl, but like Macrina, she is widowed soon thereafter, and she exercises her right not to marry again. She chose to follow the example of the ascetics of the desert. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that at a certain point in the Arian theological crisis, Athanasius and some others had to flee Egypt and come to Rome for safety. And when they got to Rome, they started telling Roman stories about these people in the desert. So literally the stories of the desert, the stories of the ascetics get transferred because of the refugee status of Athanasius, who in fact appears to have met Marcella and tells her these stories, and then she aspires to live as the desert mothers, but in her own home. And she turns her palace on the Aventine Hill into a monastery. And she becomes the leader of a Roman circle of holy women, all right? Keep in mind, she rejects the standards of patrician Rome regarding marriage, even though there was one guy who was chasing her down. There was one guy who really wanted to marry her, and she said no. Clothing, she dressed very, very simply. She refused to wear any kind of jewelry. Food, she lived quite simply. And as I say, she's effectively living in a community. And in fact, I'm going to come back to St. Jerome on this, but he says of her Of gold she would not wear so much as a seal ring, choosing to store her money in the stomachs of the poor rather than keep it at her own disposal. That's a great way of describing it, to store your money in the stomachs of the poor. I think, I wonder if Leo could have used that line in Dilexite that he just published over the weekend, right? So this is all going on. That, by the way, is the Aventine Hill rising there above the Tiber River. What's also interesting is how deeply engaged in biblical scholarship she became, including scholarship of the Hebrew texts of the Bible with St. Jerome himself. And here I have to say something about Jerome, and it's kind of an interesting relationship here. Jerome, as you know, was born in Dalmatia. He's invited to Rome by the Pope. The Pope is the one who asks him to translate the Bible from Greek into Latin, thus creating the Vulgate edition of the Bible. And he's doing that, at least partially, or at least starts it, in Rome, where he meets Marcella, who in fact quite likely offered him a cottage to live in on the property of her palace on the Aventine. So she's hosting him. I guess if you're a biblical scholar and you're trying to figure out how to pay for all of that, it's nice to find a rich Christian of senatorial rank, That's kind of what happens there. And so he, therefore, got to know her quite well. In fact, the image there on the right, there are some archaeologists who believe that her home stood in the park area to the right of that church. That's the church of Sant'Alessio. Sant'Alessio was sort of a Joseph Labre type guy. A little earlier than that. There's been very little archaeological stuff done on the Aventine because it's still occupied and nobody wants to have their house dug up to find out what was there 3,000 years ago. But what's interesting is that they work together closely enough that when you look at Jerome's correspondence, and by the way, a third of his letters were written to women, okay? And of those letters, 17 were addressed to Marcella. Okay, so I'd say anybody who got 17 letters from St. Jerome is someone of some significance, worth looking at. Unfortunately, we have no letters from her, and that's kind of the historiographical problem again. We know about Marcella we get from Jerome. So there's 17 letters to her where he's saying different things, and at one point he's actually saying to her, you got to stop asking me these questions about the Hebrew text because I was up all last night trying to figure out the meaning of such and such, okay? So they were quite literally going back and forth about the Hebrew text of the Bible. And after her death, he actually wrote a letter to a close friend of hers that is effectively the only thing we've got that's really a biography of Marcella, which is really very, very interesting to read. And he mentions to her, I just want one little quotation about her. He says, he's talking about her way of living and her learning and all of that. He said, she never came to see me, that she did not ask me some question concerning them, the scriptures, nor would she at once acquiesce in my explanations, but on the contrary, would dispute them. Okay? Not, however, he says, for argument's sake, but to learn the answers to those objections which might, as she saw, be made to my statements. How much virtue and ability, how much holiness and purity I found in her, I am afraid to say. And he says, she's so learned that consequently, after my departure from Rome, in case of a dispute arising as to the testimony of Scripture on any subject, recourse was had to her to settle it. So when he left Rome and went to Bethlehem, people were coming to her as an authority on Scripture. And so wise was she, and so well did she understand what philosophers call to prepon, that is, what is becoming or appropriate in what she did, that when she answered questions, she gave her own opinion not as her own, but as from me or someone else, thus admitting that what she taught she had herself learned from others. For she knew that the apostle had said, I suffer not a woman to teach. Okay? and she would not seem to inflict a wrong upon the male sex, many of whom questioned her concerning obscure and doubtful points. Now, my suspicion is she answered them that way to make sure that they actually listened to her, right? In other words, that's a strategy for navigating the restrictions at that time.
Still is.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like, how do you make an argument, right? It's like the rhetorical pieces of this. Her life came to an end at the time of the sack of Rome in 410, when Alaric and the Goths came through the city gates. She wasn't a martyr, but soldiers broke into her home, roughed her up. She was about 80 at that time. Alaric actually, talk about hysteria. Jerome was back in Bethlehem at that time, and when he heard about Rome being sacked, he was so upset about it. He wrote in very colorful language about how terrible it was. In fact, Alaric told the Goths that when they go in there, don't destroy any of the buildings, don't kill people, take what you can carry. And he designated a number of churches in Rome as places of sanctuary. So sanctuary churches in Rome, one of which was St. Paul's outside the walls, where she went and she died inside the church of St. Paul's outside the walls a couple of weeks after the sack took place. So in other words, she's a person widely remembered, but perhaps not remembered as well today as someone of asceticism. Another rich woman, socially connected, who puts all of her goods at the use of the church. So what are the implications for us? Because I have to say, when I have my students read this stuff, they're scratching their head at first, wondering, what is Murphy doing here? I guess one question I'd ask is this, especially for most of these people, they're doing that ascetic stuff when the wheels are already starting to come off of the Roman Empire, right? In other words, they're not doing this when Rome is at its height, but when it's already starting to break up. Are we living in a period of similar social and political change? In other words, are we living in an end of empire moment? And what does it mean to radically follow the gospel when all of the assumptions about what society is going to be like are going to be different? And so when we ask our students to perhaps dip into this a little bit, we might want to ask them, what are your hopes? If you were having to follow the evangelical counsels today, what would it mean? You might not go off to the desert and kick out the snakes, but there might be something you'd have to do that's equally frightening to many people. What would it mean for us and for our students to reject the pretensions of the world around us, right? In other words, we can either hold these people up. If we hold these people, the ascetics of the desert, up as examples to be imitated, we're going to fail. Because nobody's going to imitate completely a 4th century saint, but they can draw from them to figure out how they are going to respond constructively to the evangelical counsels. And if we do want to do this, if we or our students do this, is that because a radically committed Christian is rejecting a powerful culture, or simply rejecting the bankruptcy and hollowness of exhausted projects, be they political or religious? I'm going to jump forward in history a little bit, and this year I'm starting to work on a paper on a Jesuit saint named Aloysius Gonzaga. St. Aloysius, the patron of youth. I wrote a book earlier in my career on a cardinal of the Gonzaga family. And the Jesuits made a great big deal when he entered the Jesuits. They thought it was a terrific PR victory that the scion of an Italian ruling family joined the Young Society of Jesus, and there's much made of the fact that he left behind this tremendous inheritance. But you know what? He was going to inherit a kind of third-ranked little place where the major town has 12,000 people in it today. In other words, I think he was recognizing that what he was giving up was a charade anyhow, right? In other words, the Habsburgs were dominating all of Italy. There wasn't really much to this inheritance besides the title. And I think the real courage of Aloysius of Gonzaga was that he was willing to call time on a system that was becoming increasingly bankrupt politically and ethically and all of that. How do we help our students call time on the things that are really not as substantial as we once believed they were. So just as the desert fathers and mothers chose to reject and be countercultural in the face of an empire that was in twilight, where is Twilight today, and what are we asking our students to do? And that's it, I'm done. But I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think? You run into these students all the time. And I know I'm not the first person to tell you about Anthony of the Desert, but anything? Yeah.
I think there's parallels, but so it's at once a rejection of much in culture, but it's also sometimes a reclamation of the Christian roots of the culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit different than this.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a countercultural aspect to it, but the countercultural aspect is reclaiming the original culture.
Right, going back to the original culture and recognizing that you're not going to identify the gospel with any culture. And effectively what happens is that whatever, it might have been a twilight for Rome, but it was dawn for somebody else. And so how do you build that life of authenticity? I mean, as you know, especially with high school kids, I mean, honest to God, they can smell inauthenticity from 3 miles away, right? So how do they find a way to be a part of something that's dawning? You know, that would be a way, maybe another way of getting at what you're saying. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Yeah.
I think sorry, I'm way down here. I think some of what we are seeing, or what I'm seeing anyway with young people, is that they're rejecting what's hollow and inauthentic about the church and its institutions. And so part of the challenge of saying we're going to step back to our roots, or that there's something liberative or liberating within Christian tradition, is a hard sell for students who are seeing the church and its institutions and its leaders and its people and its spokespeople particularly as a big part of what's dying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about the fact of the matter is we all face the reality, and we all hate, I mean, as the nuns increase, the N-O-N-E-S increase, the reality is that most of the people we're all teaching will not regularly be attending Mass on Sundays in the years ahead. And as a father of 2 daughters, that's important, that's a significant reality to me. And if we only tell them that we want them to be faithful to a paradigm whose time may be over, then we're going to lose them entirely. So how do we make the gospel something so engaging that they in fact will, but it's not going to look the same as it did, right? I mean, I come from a family, probably the first generation of my family where somebody didn't enter a religious order, right? You know, my great aunt, entered the BVMs, she's buried in the same cemetery that Sister Jean of Loyola Chicago is going to be buried in out there in Dubuque, Iowa, right? I mean, when young men and young women entered religious orders in the 1920s, they were entering an establishment that was strong, right? So how do we inspire and encourage young people to make choices that are as brave as those of my own Sister Mary Antonina in this changing world? How does the church maintain the allegiance of young people through their imaginations? Maybe through K-pop demon hunters. I don't know. Yeah.
So this is an experience I've had more in like adult catechism, but I see it in some of the students too. So like you have like the patristic period, the modern period, and then the postmodern period. And so you can convince people nowadays they're in just an absolute hellscape. Postmodernism is stupid. But then their move is to go back to modernism where things have to be highly rationalized. You have to make a formal argument. Where faith is a first principle, you're not going to make a rational argument for it. My question then is, would you argue that looking at the ancient ascetics and the desert fathers, would that be a way to kind of just avoid that whole cycle? Where in the land where everyone kind of has their own truth, they have such a particular focused experience that truth just wins? I don't know if that makes sense.
Good question. I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I hadn't thought about it that way. But I do think of, something that Pope Francis said a few years ago where he was talking about how, people aren't entirely inspired any longer by documents,
Right.
but by example, right? And that's why it's sort of like, in a way, what might be it is this notion in the late antiquity of holiness is to be found in persons, and the best thing to do is go and watch the person who's holy and let their authenticity become an authoritative voice, without getting into an argument about whether modernism is all wrong or antithetical to Christianity. I owe an awful lot to modernism. The modern university exists to a certain extent because of that, right? And in history as an academic field. So, but that's an interesting way of looking at it, or asking the question. Yeah.
So, like, it was struck me when you were talking how many parallels there are between the figures that you pointed to and Francis and Clare, and their backgrounds is coming from royal means and having privilege, and that's not quite 1,000 years after this, and then 1,000 years since Francis and Clare. I feel like the world is coming to an end for me because I'm from the 20th century and the 21st century with AI and all this stuff in it. You talk about authenticity a little bit, and I'm wondering whether or not the next group will be kids who came from this wealth, this privilege of all the stuff that comes with it, and they find it to be bankrupt. And that I think that but the thing is, if they're getting the gospel from a YouTube personality, and they decide that they're gonna be Luddites, and they don't want AI, but they don't want the technology, they'll have to figure out what the faith is without those phones, without the internet, and that's fascinating. I'd be curious to know where they're gonna look, like what person they'll look to, because if they throw away the tech because they've decided it's bankrupt, they're gonna have to model their lives on something.
Yeah.
And it just seems like it is a pattern, and the fact that the people you presented, and Francis and Clare, had such privilege, had such wealth, and found it to be not as valuable as the gospel. What does that look like in the 21st century? I'll be curious to see.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think. I don't know.
You're right. I mean, who are what's it going to be? I'm not sure. And of course, that's the other thing is, all of this leads up to, in a sense, if there was a next slide on the show, it would probably be Benedict or something, right? But then once you get into Benedict, you're ending up in a totally different paradigm than the ancient world. But you're right. Where is it going to come from? And the whole AI thing, I don't know. Yeah.
My students have been impressed with like a Carlo Acutis and how someone would choose to use their time on the internet instead of video games, but for doing something towards faith. And so that's been somebody that they've been more interested in learning about.
Yeah.
Kind of on a similar point, like, I think the whole idea of imitation, finding the person you can see as the model of holiness, and then doing it yourself. Like, I know in my own, I'm older, part of the younger generation, but it was finding those people on YouTube or wherever. It's like, I like what you're doing. How can I do what you're doing in my own life? That taking it from the head and moving it to the heart. It's like making it your own sort of thing. Like for Saudi or Acutis, like look what you've done. How can I do these things that you've done, but for me, not you?
Could I add something from online?
Hi, sure. Hi. What's your name and where are you coming from?
My name's Nicole Finney, and I'm from Rochester, New York area.
Great.
And I teach at McQuaid Jesuit, but I myself am Eastern Orthodox. And my husband's actually studying patristics at a seminary right now. I can say that we tend to have right now coming to our church a surplus of young men. And how they are getting there is some by, their favorite podcasters and, YouTube personalities. But a lot of them are doing the research. They're going back to look at the early church and see what it was and if it's still there. And they're showing up in mass. We have a guy problem where the girls aren't coming for some reason, but the young men are. So I would say that in a time when things seem chaotic, they're looking for tradition, and they're looking for things that are, ancient to them to see if it's applicable to their lives today, and getting them to church is the first part, and then having someone available to guide them through the history of the church, and then offering community for them, and also just allowing the grace of the services, especially the liturgy, to permeate them. So the experience itself is what's gonna solidify them in being part of a parish. I don't know if that helps, but that has been my recent experience.
Thank you. Anybody else on that? You?
Okay, I can raise my hand. I also think as a secondary thought is that, I also think for many of us in the room, even using the term marginalized, I think those in whom are trying to find experiences and still being in a hollowed effect of it, like they don't even realize how lacking they are in poor spirit, right? Like so, because of what they're trying to seek and cannot find. And I think that's what you presented today as the antithesis of us, I guess, also recognizing like what is poor spirit and what really brings about the greater orientation of our because I think a lot of us are teaching to those students and families that are coming from these places of what they think they're finding, you know, on the onset.
Good. All right, I think I'm supposed to wrap this up. I got a signal from the producer. Like that. So thank you very much. Have a great day.